All right. Well, some headlines for you, and I'll start with one. Steven Strasburg officially retired. I know there was a little back and forth with that. A guy who was a playoff hero, World Series. Was he the World Series MVP or the CS MVP? One of the two.
Sure.
Back in 2019 with the Nationals, and now only a couple years removed. Injuries and injuries is a big storyline this weekend, and he retires.
Yeah, and I saw what was it? It was he was guaranteed or he was signed a $245 million
Well, there was an
contract and
argument about
through
that.
right.
They
Yeah, yeah,
they were basically told him like, "Hey, we don't want to pay you this," and it was back and forth with the Nationals, just ridiculous stuff going
yeah.
on there. So, I guess
And
they resolved it.
I actually think this is probably a pretty fitting place to start when we consider all the injuries that are happening because Steven Strasburg feels like one of the first guys who, threw hard and ran into a lot of injury concerns, especially with his arm. And so this is probably a fitting place to start with some of these other injuries that we're going to touch on.
Yeah, and he was a little different because he did throw the 100 miles an hour, but he was also a guy, and I'll never forget. I spent my summers growing up in DC, so I'll never forget that first start against the Pirates, or what he had 14 strikeouts or something in his major league debut. Ridiculous stuff. Um, and he's throwing that big curveball. That was also part of it, where like his elbow's blown out. But now we're seeing all these UCL injuries. And I don't know if the UCL is that different than the other elbow injuries than we've seen in the past, but you mentioned it. So Bieber, Strider, even a guy who's not maybe on your radar as much for fantasy purposes, but Jonathan Loaizaga,
Mhm.
those three guys all now. Strider, we don't know what the extent is yet, but Bieber and Loaizaga definitely out for the season, the same UCL injury. Uh, and that's a big problem for Major League Baseball right now.
Yeah, and there's a lot of back and forth on Twitter about, what is the cause, right? Is it
Yeah, and I mean, it's been happening all morning this morning on WFAN. I'm hearing, "Oh, it's the pitch clock." I don't think that's true. 20 years ago, there wasn't a ton of time between pitches like there is. Um, a lot of people are saying the velocity. The thing that I still think is the maybe the biggest issue is probably, what's going on right now without the sticky stuff. That's when it really felt like it ramped up, and obviously, remember Tyler Glasnow's rant where he's like, "Hey, I have to grip the ball a little harder. I have these big ass hands. I don't my hands should be able to just it should just be free and easy, but the second I start having to grip it a little tighter, all of a sudden, I'm starting to feel things in my arm that I never felt before."
Mhm. Yeah, and especially when they're using new baseballs every, 5 pitches or something, like,
Yeah, and
there's
they're
slick
constantly
balls, right?
changing the
Mhm.
ball also, right?
Yep.
Where there's the juice ball, there's the not juice ball.
Yeah.
What's going on? Yep.
So I happen to think it's probably a combination of, 10 different things. Yes, the velocity is one, increased spin rates, you're flicking your wrists a little bit harder. So it's not just like you can pinpoint one thing. I think it's just a culmination of, the past 10 years of how we viewed pitchers. Everybody wants increased velocity, everybody wants increased spin rates, but even the pitch clock maybe has a little bit something. Maybe we're just that was like a tipping point, right? So I don't think there's one scapegoat that we can point to, but I do think it's an important question to ask, Rami, right? This is going to get figured out over the next few years. I don't know how long some of this is going to take, but how do we now value pitchers from a fantasy standpoint, right? Because this is a fantasy podcast. How do we tell you to draft pitchers or to handle pitchers? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think the biggest, and we'll get to this in a minute, but the biggest way to do it is to stream them. Like whoever's hot, whoever's healthy, because we talked about this. I was consistent on this from day one when we started this podcast. I'm not going to draft the top end guys at the top of a draft anymore. I mean, look at some of the guys who in our draft were drafted at the top. You Strider and Cole were 1, 2, top two pitchers, right? And now Strider is going to be out for who knows how long, and then Cole's already been out. And Aaron Boone actually spoke to the media this morning already and said that Cole's going to resume throwing actually as soon as tomorrow, possibly playing catch. That's great. But when you look at some of the top guys, and then one of the other headlines I want to get to, but look at a guy like Michael Waka, who comes out of nowhere again and is just dealing. He's shoving. Like yesterday, his outing for Kansas City was incredible. And it's like, wait, maybe we could just find innings here. Maybe you find pitching here. And it's kind of what I'm doing in my other league. And it's harder to do it in our league where you can only set the lineup once a week. But in my
Right.
other league, I have like a few pitchers that I have consistently. And there's like 2, 3 slots. And I'm just turning out like every day someone new is in there. And I'm trying to find value, almost like playing like a defense when you would stream a defense in fantasy football, where you see what their matchup is. Oh, they're playing against the Jets. for all those years when it was like playing against the Arizona Cardinals, it's like, oh, this is great. I'm just going to plug this defense in and they're going to dominate because they're playing against this crappy offense. So, it's the same thing here. If you see a team that's playing against the Oakland A's, basically AAA, right? It's like,
Yeah.
hey, let me find a pitcher who's going there. You see a pitcher who's going to be playing, I don't know, in terrible weather like we had in Pittsburgh over the weekend, right? Where it's basically snowing on Friday. Let me find a pitcher. Now, it's not great, if you're in either of those teams, are pretty good offensive teams, both Pittsburgh and Baltimore. But there's various scenarios that you could find pitchers, or maybe you find whoever's hot on the Tampa Bay Rays because they seem to have hot starting pitchers come out of the woodwork. Go find them. And a couple of guys who I want to get to when we talk about streaming pitchers a little later, who are like guys who have been around and now all of a sudden they're contributing. Again, and it's like, wait, okay, these guys are back now. So a lot of different things. What's your take on it with starting pitching and how we view it?
Yeah, so I I think I tend to agree with you, right? It has to be a matchup based thing because I'm even, just thinking ahead to next year. I don't know if I'm going to be drafting any of the top 5, 6 pitchers, especially, I mean, depending on where they go. But if you're talking about using like a top 50 pick, like I just can't risk having that happen, in the first couple weeks, couple months, right? For one of your top 50 picks to just go down and have no production throughout the end of the year. Like it's just not worth it, right? Those are picks that you need to get production from. And that's why I preach, draft with a safe floor. There's just no safety anymore with pitchers. And so I 100% agree with you, right? Like we need to play matchups. We need to find, and this is what I've talked about too, being consistent and vigilant on waiver wire pickups is extremely important because you're going to have injuries, you're going to have things pop up, and you need to know who is out there, who's available, and who's going to provide some fantasy value, whether it's for a week or a month or whatever the case is.
Yeah, and this is why, I mean, auction leagues again are the way to do it because in an auction league, the value is set by the market, right? Like every league creates its own market for what they value based on how people are bidding. And if you're in a league with savvy owners, most likely, the top pitchers, even the top guys, were going for like 30, 35 max dollars. Whereas like that second tier of really top pitchers who are still in the top 10 of pitchers are probably going for like $25, like I talked about with Luis Castillo going for like 26, $27. And the same thing with Zach Wheeler going for 26, $27. Um, as opposed to the top players in the league are going for $55. You know what I mean? So all of a sudden you're talking about a huge gap between the top starting pitchers versus the top, offensive players in the league that are a little bit more reliable. And sometimes it's so interesting because you'd think like, oh, you need to find the guys who have been consistently healthy. But I kind of was thinking like, I don't know. Like I actually said before the year without jinxing it because I'm a Yankee fan. I was like, I don't want to jinx it, but Garrett Cole has been really healthy lately, and he's 34 years old now or 33, and he's had a ton of innings on his arm. A guy like Zach Wheeler, who's been the epitome of like reliable, because he's always been healthy. When does at one point it's like, oh, he's pitching the playoffs every year now. He's thrown close to 300 innings, probably not 300, but 250, regular season and playoff innings together. Each of the last 4 or 5 years, when's it going to catch up? And then obviously you talk about the guys who just seem to never be healthy. When you talk about a guy like Glass, now when you talk about a guy like a Jacob DeGrom. So, again, this is something. And DeGrom even was a guy who was healthy every year for years until the last couple of years. So uh, it's a weird thing. And one of those guys who always has had to deal with injuries was Luis Severino, but his second start, I think, was more representative of what we can expect from him this year. Don't you agree?
Yeah, and I do think this is where, we talk about what are some big problems with baseball. The only healthy pitchers that we have that have been Cy Young winners is Blake Snell, and then there's one more that I missed. Oh, and Corbin Burns, right? And these are some of your best pitchers. Garrett Cole now potentially out for quite a while. Justin Verlander, Sandy Alcantara, Robbie Ray, Shane Bieber, Jacob DeGrom. You mentioned it, like Max Scherzer. These are the best pitchers in the game, and they're just if they can't stay healthy, like that's, I think, we talk about what is a big problem for MLB all the time. Like what are some of their biggest problems? I think that's pretty big right now. I think that might be their biggest thing. And we just saw too the MLBPA came out with a statement, and I don't know if you saw MLB responded. I think it
Yep,
was just this
they're
morning.
blaming the
Mhm.
yeah.
They're blaming like the high spin rates and then the velocity, teams chasing velocity. MLB is so. Yeah,
Right, the
it'll be
PA is blaming the pitch clock.
yeah.
Yep.
Oh, right. Yep, I didn't mention that. So, it'll be an interesting back and forth, right, between the Players Association and the MLB, and like I said, we'll follow it along. But how does it
And
impact
it's probably a
fantasy? Yeah,
combination of things, and it's probably different for each
mhm,
athlete, and
right.
honestly, right?
Yep. And how do we play it for fantasy? Well, like you said, you just got to kind of you almost devalue pitching as a whole, right? And like you mentioned, how you play defenses, like defenses in fantasy football are just devalued, right? And so we'll do the same in fantasy baseball, where I may not take a pitcher for the first 4 or 5 rounds next year, and just build up the best offense that I can.
Yeah, that would be something interesting. It's almost like quarterbacks in fantasy football, which is crazy because like quarterbacks, like there's so many that can get
Right.
you unless you have like one of the guys who are running a ton, like Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. Um, the other big stories I think are welcome to the fantasy season so far. Evan Carter and Nolan Jones finally start to pick it up over the weekend. So congrats, welcome guys. Big round of applause to you guys because they had done nothing prior to this weekend, and finally it feels like maybe they're starting to get to what we expect from those two guys who were pretty big hyped coming into the season.
I think another thing that we should discuss too is the quick fall off of Starling Marte that you took a victory lap so soon on last week. I'm taking my victory
He
lap
had a good
right
game
now. He did?
Saturday.
Okay.
He had a
Yeah, he
good
got
game
that
Saturday.
average up to 233. Yes, like we love to see
Yeah,
it.
because we're in an average league. Exactly. We play in an average league. He's
What's
still
his
like batting. He's
OBP's
still on.
300.
Yeah, exactly. All right. It's
What's
higher
that?
than your team OBP through a week, by the way. I don't know if you want
Hey,
to mention
hey,
that. What are you at
watch it.
270 right
Hey,
now?
I'm still beating
So
you. You're losing to a guy with 270 OBP. Um,
yeah. It's tight. It's tight. Well, and this is the frustrating part. I guess we'll talk about it on Thursday's
yeah,
episode. We'll talk about what ended up happening in that matchup. So good luck to you today.
yeah, you
I
too, you
wish
too.
I
There's
wish
a
you luck.
couple things that could swing. So yeah, we'll see.
Oh, for sure. A lot of things that could swing. The other thing that I think is a big story, Anthony Rendon got a hit
Yeah.
first time in a couple of years. So congrats, Tony, to get off the schneid, as they say.
Who says
And
that?
so that's a big that makes headlines, I think.
Get off the schneid?
I think that's the thing they say.
Who's they?
Everyone says that all the time.
Nobody says
I mean,
that.
there's no reason for you to be like even questioning that. People say that all the time.